It was August 12, 1979, in Pine Hollow, Alabama. The kind of summer evening where the air sits heavy on your shoulders, thick with humidity and the smell of fried dough and cotton candy. The annual town fair had returned to the muddy field behind the First Baptist Church, and for one night, Pine Hollow felt alive in a way it never did the other 364 days of the year. Strings of yellow bulbs hung between wooden poles, swaying gently in the breeze. A country band played on a makeshift stage near the entrance, their guitars twanging through speakers that crackled with static. Children ran between the game booths, clutching stuffed animals and candy apples. Teenagers gathered near the Ferris wheel, smoking cigarettes and laughing too loud. The older folks sat on folding chairs near the food stands, fanning themselves with paper plates and trading gossip. Pine Hollow was a town of just under 2,000 people. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets didn't stay buried long. But that night, something would vanish that no one could explain. Her name was Diane Keller, 23 years old. Dark blonde hair that fell just past her shoulders, usually tied back with a ribbon or a simple clip. She had green eyes that seemed to notice everything. The kind of eyes that made children feel seen and adults feel a little ashamed when they'd done something wrong. She taught second grade at Pine Hollow Elementary, and everyone agreed she was good at it. Patient, kind, the sort of teacher who stayed late to help a struggling student, who brought her own books from home when the school library ran dry. Diane had grown up in Pine Hollow. Her father, Carl Keller, ran the hardware store on Main Street. Her mother, Ruth, volunteered at the church and organized the annual bake sale. Diane had an older brother, Michael, who'd left for Tuscaloosa years ago and rarely came back. The Kellers were well liked, respectable, quiet. Diane lived alone in a small rental house on Oakwood Drive, a narrow street lined with magnolia trees. She drove a blue Ford Pinto, a car she'd bought used 2 years earlier with money saved from substitute teaching. She liked to read mystery novels, listen to Fleetwood Mac on her record player, and take long walks along the dirt roads that stretched out past the edge of town. She wasn't particularly close with many people her age. Most of her high school friends had moved away or gotten married and started families. Diane seemed content with her quiet life, though some whispered she was lonely. Others said she was just particular, selective. That evening, Diane arrived at the fair around 7:30. She wore a light yellow sundress with small white flowers printed on the fabric, and a denim jacket draped over her shoulders. Her hair was down, catching the breeze. She carried a small brown purse with a long strap. She walked through the entrance alone, smiling politely at the ticket taker, a man named Horace, who worked at the gas station during the week. "Evening, Miss Keller," he said, tipping his cap. "Evening, Horace." She paid her $1 and walked into the fair. For the next few hours, Diane moved through the crowd like a ghost. She was there, but not entirely present. Several people would later recall seeing her, though their memories would differ in small but significant ways. Margaret Pruitt, who ran the ring toss booth, remembered Diane stopping by around 8 o'clock. She said Diane seemed distracted, kept glancing over her shoulder. "I asked if she was looking for someone." Margaret would later tell the sheriff. She just smiled and said no, but I could tell something was on her mind. Floyd Tanner, a farmer who lived out past the railroad tracks, claimed he saw Diane near the food stands around 8:30, talking to a man he didn't recognize. He described the man as tall, maybe in his 30s, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. Floyd said they seemed to be arguing, though he couldn't hear what they were saying. But when the sheriff asked Floyd to describe the man more clearly, his details became vague. The man's face couldn't say. His hair color, dark, maybe, or light brown. Floyd wasn't sure. He'd had a few beers by then. Reverend Paul Whitmore, the pastor at First Baptist, said he saw Diane sitting alone on a bench near the Ferris wheel around 9:15. He thought about approaching her, asking if she was all right, but the line at the corndog stand was long, and he was hungry. He regretted that decision for the rest of his life. The last confirmed sighting came from Jenny Holloway, a waitress at the diner on Route 12. Jenny was working the funnel cake stand that night, and she swore she saw Diane walking toward the parking area around 11:45. She was alone, Jenny said, walking fast, like she was in a hurry. "I called out to her, but I don't think she heard me." The band was loud. Diane's blue Ford Pinto was parked near the edge of the lot, beneath a crooked oak tree. By midnight, the fair was winding down. The band packed up their instruments. Families loaded tired children into station wagons and pickup trucks. The lights began to flicker off, one strand at a time. Diane Keller was gone. At first, no one noticed. It wasn't until the next morning, Sunday, August 13th, that the absence became real. Ruth Keller had expected her daughter for lunch after church. Diane always came on Sundays. It was a ritual. Ruth would make fried chicken and mashed potatoes, and Diane would help wash the dishes while they talked about the week. But that Sunday, Diane didn't show. Ruth called the rental house. No answer. She called again an hour later. Still nothing. By 3 o'clock, Ruth was standing on Carl's porch, wringing her hands. "Something's wrong," she said. Diane wouldn't just not show up. Carl tried to reassure her. Maybe Diane had driven to Birmingham for the day. Maybe she'd stayed late at a friend's house. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Diane was dependable, predictable. Carl drove to the rental house. The front door was locked. He peered through the windows. Everything looked normal. Diane's car wasn't there. He drove back to the fairgrounds. The field was empty now, littered with trash and trampled grass. A few workers were dismantling the booths. And then he saw it. The blue Ford Pinto, still parked under the oak tree. Alone, Carl walked over slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. The keys were still in the ignition, dangling from a keychain shaped like a small wooden apple. Diane's favorite, a gift from one of her students. The interior of the car was undisturbed. No signs of a struggle. Diane's purse wasn't inside. Her jacket was gone. Carl stood there for a long time, staring at the open door. Then he drove to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Raymond Coulter was 52 years old, a man with a thick mustache and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. He'd been sheriff of Pine Hollow for nearly 20 years, and in that time, the most serious crime he'd dealt with was a string of mailbox vandalism back in 1974, when Carl Keller walked into his office that Sunday afternoon. Pale and shaking, Coulter knew immediately that something was different. "She's gone," Carl said. "Diane's gone." Coulter asked the necessary questions. "When did you last see her? Where was she going? Did she seem upset?" Carl answered as best he could, but the answers only raised more question. By evening, a search was organized. Volunteers gathered at the fairgrounds, neighbors, teachers, men from the church. They spread out in groups, walking through the woods that bordered the field, calling Diane's name. Flashlights bobbed through the trees like fireflies. They searched until midnight, found nothing. The next morning, Sheriff Coulter returned to the Pinto. He examined it more carefully this time, dusting the door handle for fingerprints, checking the trunk, empty. He found a single earring on the floor of the passenger side, small silver hoop. Ruth Keller confirmed it was Diane's. Coulter interviewed everyone who'd been at the fair. Most people remembered seeing Diane, but no one could agree on the details. Some said she looked happy. Others said she looked worried. One man claimed she'd been arguing with someone. Another said she'd been alone the whole time. The inconsistencies piled up like kindling. On August 15th, 3 days after the disappearance, a farmer named Luther Boone was driving his truck across Miller's Bridge, a narrow wooden structure that spanned the Tallapoosa River about 6 miles south of town. As he crossed, something caught his eye. Tire tracks in the mud near the edge of the bridge. Fresh, he stopped and got out. The tracks led right up to the guardrail, then stopped. Luther peered over the edge. The river below was dark and slow-moving, choked with weeds and fallen branches. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. Coulter organized a search of the riverbank. Divers were brought in from Montgomery. They combed the water for 2 days, dragging nets and metal detectors through the muck. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no purse, just the tracks and the silence. By the end of August, the story had spread beyond Pine Hollow. A small article appeared in the Birmingham News. Local teacher missing after town fair. A few reporters came through, asked questions, took photos of the Pinto, and left. But as the weeks turned into months, the attention faded. Diane Keller became a name people whispered about in grocery store aisles and church parking, a mystery that didn't have an ending. Ruth Keller kept Diane's room exactly as it had been. The bed made, the books on the shelf, the record player silent. Carl stopped going to the hardware store as often. He'd stand behind the counter, staring out the window, waiting for a blue Pinto to pull up that never did. And Sheriff Raymond Coulter kept the case file open on his desk, a growing stack of papers that led nowhere. The town fair came back the next summer, and the summer after that. The Ferris wheel turned. The country band played. Children laughed. But the field behind the First Baptist Church never felt the same. Because everyone knew Diane Keller had walked into that crowd on a humid August night, and she had never walked out. And no one could explain why. September 1979, the heat of summer had begun to ease, but the questions remained as suffocating as ever. Sheriff Raymond Coulter sat in his office on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by witness statements that contradicted each other in ways that made his head ache. He'd been a lawman long enough to know that memory was unreliable, that people saw what they expected to see, heard what they wanted to hear. But this case was different. This wasn't just forgetfulness or confusion. It felt deliberate. Coulter spread the statements across his desk and read them again, one by one, searching for a thread that made sense. Floyd Tanner said he'd seen Diane arguing with a tall man in a plaid shirt near the food stands around 8:30. But when pressed for details, Floyd couldn't describe the man's face, couldn't remember if he was young or old, couldn't even say for certain what color the shirt was, red and black checks, or maybe blue. Floyd had been drinking that night. He admitted as much, but he insisted he'd seen something. Margaret Pruitt, who ran the ring toss booth, said Diane had stopped by around 8 o'clock and seemed distracted, kept looking over her shoulder as if waiting for someone. But Margaret also said Diane had been alone. No tall man. No argument. Jenny Holloway, the waitress working the funnel cake stand, swore she'd seen Diane walking toward the parking lot just before midnight, moving quickly like she was in a hurry to leave. But Jenny had been busy that night, serving customers, wiping down counters. Could she really be certain of the time? Could she be certain it was Diane? And then there was Tommy Granger. Tommy was 25 years old, a mechanic who worked at Bledsoe's auto repair on the edge of town. He had dark hair, a lean build, and a reputation for drinking too much on weekends. He and Diane had dated briefly the year before 3 months, maybe 4 before she'd ended it. People said Tommy had taken it hard, that he'd called her house late at night, that he'd shown up at the school once, wanting to talk, and the principal had asked him to leave. Jenny Holloway claimed she'd seen Tommy at the fair that night, standing near the entrance around 10:30, watching the crowd. She said he looked agitated, kept pacing back and forth, hands in his pockets. But when Coulter brought Tommy in for questioning, Tommy said he hadn't been at the fair at all, said he'd been home that night, working on his truck in the driveway. His mother, Clara Granger, confirmed it, said Tommy had been there all evening, didn't leave until the next morning. Coulter didn't believe him, but he couldn't prove otherwise. There were no security cameras at the fair, no ticket stubs with names on them, just a dollar bill handed to Horace at the gate, and a sea of faces that blurred together in the heat and the noise. Coulter leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been a sheriff for nearly 20 years, and he'd never felt this lost. The investigation continued, but it moved slowly, like wading through mud. Coulter interviewed everyone who'd been at the fair. He talked to Diane's co-workers at the school, her neighbors on Oakwood Drive, the regulars at the diner where she sometimes ate breakfast on Saturdays. He asked the same questions over and over, hoping someone would remember something new, something useful. But the answers were always the same. Diane was quiet, kept to herself, seemed happy enough, though maybe a little lonely. No enemies, no debts, no reason to run away, no reason to disappear. In late September, a tip came in. A man named Eugene Bartlett, who lived in a trailer out near the county line, called the sheriff's office and said he'd given Diane a ride the night she disappeared. Said he'd been driving south on Route 12 around midnight when he saw a young woman walking along the shoulder of the road, thumb out, looking for a lift. He'd stopped, she'd gotten in, said she was headed to Birmingham, needed to catch a bus. Coulter drove out to Eugene's trailer the next morning. Eugene was in his 50s, a wiry man with thinning hair and tobacco-stained fingers. He worked odd jobs, roofing, landscaping, whatever paid cash. He lived alone, no family, no record. Coulter asked him to describe the woman he'd picked up. Blonde, Eugene said. Pretty, wearing a yellow dress, I think. Or maybe it was white. Hard to say in the dark. Did she tell you her name? Nope, didn't ask. Where'd you drop her off? Truck stop outside Montgomery. She thanked me and walked off. That's the last I saw of her. Single quotes. Coulter made notes. Asked if Eugene remembered anything else. The way she spoke. What she carried. Whether she seemed scared. Eugene shrugged. She seemed fine. Tired, maybe. But fine. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Didn't know she was missing. Don't read the papers much. Single quotes, Coulter studied the man's face, looking for a lie. But Eugene just sat there, calm and unbothered, chewing on a toothpick. Coulter thanked him and left. Back at the station, he made calls, checked with the Montgomery police, asked if anyone matching Diane's description had been seen at the truck stop or the bus station. No one had. He checked with the bus company. No tickets sold to anyone named Diane Keller. No records of a young woman traveling alone to Atlanta or anywhere else. Eugene's story didn't add up. But it didn't not add up, either. It just hung there, like so many other pieces of this case, impossible to confirm or dismiss. By October, the town had begun to fracture. Two versions of the story took root, and people chose sides the way they might choose a favorite football team or a candidate in an election. There were those who believed Diane had been murdered. They pointed to Tommy Granger, said he'd been obsessed with her, said he couldn't let go, said he'd done something terrible that night at the fair, and now he was hiding behind his mother's alibi. They whispered about it at the diner, at the church, in the aisles of the Piggly Wiggly. Some even avoided Bledsoe's auto repair, taking their cars to the next town over rather than let Tommy touch them. Tommy felt it, the stares, the silence when he walked into a room. He stopped going to the bar on Friday nights, stopped showing up at the church his mother attended. He worked, went home, and stayed there. Clara Granger defended her son fiercely. She told anyone who would listen that Tommy had been home that night, that he had nothing to do with Diane's disappearance, that people were cruel and quick to judge. But even her voice carried a note of desperation, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. And then there were those who believed Diane had run away. They pointed to Eugene Bartlett's story, to the rumor that Diane had been offered a teaching job in Atlanta and was planning to leave Pine Hollow quietly, without making a fuss, to the fact that her purse had never been found, which meant she'd taken it with her, to the way she'd seemed distracted at the fair, as if her mind was already somewhere else. Reverend Paul Whitmore was one of the believers in this version. He'd known Diane since she was a child, and he said she'd always been restless, always looking beyond the borders of Pine Hollow. He said she'd come to him a few weeks before the fair, asked him about starting over, about whether it was wrong to want more than what you'd been given. She wanted to leave, Whitmore said in a sermon that October, his voice heavy with conviction. She wanted a new life, and we should pray that she found it. But Ruth Keller sat in the front pew, her hands clenched in her lap, and when the service ended, she walked out without speaking to anyone. She knew her daughter. Diane wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. In November, Coulter received a call from a deputy in Jefferson County. A body had been found in a wooded area near the Coosa River, about 60 miles northeast of Pine Hollow. Female, early 20s, blonde hair. Coulter drove up with Carl Keller. They stood in the coroner's office, staring at the body on the table. The woman's face was swollen, unrecognizably. Her clothing had rotted away, but she was the right age, the right build. Carl's hands shook. The coroner ran dental records. It wasn't Diane. Carl wept anyway. The winter of 1979 passed slowly. Christmas came and went. The Keller house stayed dark. Ruth didn't put up a tree. Carl worked late at the hardware store, avoiding home, avoiding the empty chair at the dinner table. Sheriff Coulter kept working the case, but leads had dried up. He sent Diane's photograph to police departments across Alabama, across the South, across the country. He checked missing persons databases. He followed up on tips that went nowhere. He interviewed Tommy Granger 3 more times. Each time, Tommy's story stayed the same. Home, working on the truck. Didn't go to the fair. Coulter almost believed him. Almost. In March 1980, a reporter from the Birmingham News came back to Pine Hollow, writing a follow-up piece on the case. She interviewed Coulter, the Kellers, a few townspeople. She asked the question everyone was asking. What happened to Diane Keller? Coulter didn't have an answer. The article ran on a Sunday. By Monday, it was lining bird cages. In June 1980, 10 months after Diane disappeared, something changed. A young deputy named Marion Steele, who'd been hired the previous year, was going through old case files in the storage room at the station. She was looking for a report on a burglary from 1978 when she came across Diane Keller's file. She opened it and immediately noticed something wrong. There were gaps, references to evidence that should have been in the file, but wasn't. A notation about Polaroid photographs taken at the scene of the abandoned Pinto. A mention of cassette tapes interviews with witnesses, recorded on Coulter's handheld recorder, a description of a gold ring found in the glove compartment of Diane's car, engraved with the initials DK. But none of these items were in the file. Marion brought it to Coulter's attention. Coulter went pale. He tore through the storage room, checking boxes, searching shelves. The photographs were gone. The tapes were gone. The ring was gone. When were they last seen? Marion asked. Coulter couldn't remember. He'd had them in September. He was sure of that. He'd reviewed the tapes, studied the photos. The ring had been in an evidence bag, labeled and sealed. And now they were gone. Who has access to this room? Marion asked. Coulter stared at her. Everyone. It was a small station. 3 deputies, a secretary, a part-time janitor. No locked doors, no sign-in sheets. Evidence was stored in cardboard boxes on metal shelves, organized by date and case number. But no one monitored who came and went. Marion's jaw tightened. Sheriff, this is a serious problem. Coulter nodded slowly. He knew what it meant. Someone had taken the evidence, and whoever it was had access to the station. The realization settled over him like a cold weight. Someone in Pine Hollow didn't want this case solved. Marion Steele pushed for a formal investigation into the missing evidence. She suggested bringing in the state police, conducting interviews with everyone who worked at the station, checking for fingerprints. But Coulter hesitated. If word got out that evidence had disappeared from his own office, it would destroy what little credibility the investigation still had. People would assume corruption, incompetence, a cover-up. And maybe they'd be right. So Coulter made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He kept it quiet. He told Marion to let it go, to focus on other cases, to stop asking questions. He filed a brief internal report, noted the missing items, and moved on. Marion didn't agree, but she was new, young. She didn't have the authority to push back, so she let it go. But she didn't forget. By the summer of 1981, 2 years after Diane's disappearance, the case was effectively cold. Coulter still kept the file on his desk, still thought about it every day. But there were no new leads, no new tips. The phone had stopped ringing. The town had moved on, in the way towns do. People still talked about Diane, but less often. The theories had calcified into myths. The arguments had faded into uncomfortable silences. Tommy Granger left Pine Hollow in the fall of 1982, packed up his truck one morning and drove away. Didn't tell anyone where he was going. His mother said he'd gone to find work in Georgia. Some said he'd fled because he was guilty. Others said he'd fled because he couldn't stand the suspicion anymore. Either way, he never came back. The Kellers stayed. Ruth grew thinner, quieter. She stopped volunteering at the church, stopped organizing the bake sale. She spent her days at home, staring out the window, waiting. Carl sold the hardware store in 1985 and retired. He'd lost the will to keep working, to keep pretending everything was normal. They never moved out of Pine Hollow. Because what if Diane came back, and they weren't there? Sheriff Raymond Coulter retired in 1990, after 30 years in office. He handed the case file over to his successor, a younger man named Dale Griffin, and told him everything he knew. Griffin promised to keep the case open, but he never made any progress. The years passed. The 1990s came and went. The town changed. New families moved in. Old families died out. The field behind the First Baptist Church was paved over, turned into a parking lot. The Ferris wheel never came back. Ruth Keller passed away in 1998 at the age of 70. Heart failure, the doctors said. But everyone knew it was grief. Carl followed her 2 years later, and still no one knew what had happened to Diane. The case remained open, but only on paper. A folder in a filing cabinet. A name on a list. A story people told when they wanted to remind themselves that some mysteries never get solved. But the town remembered. The division remained. And the silence grew deeper with every passing year. The year 2003. 24 years had passed since Diane Keller walked into the Pine Hollow Town Fair and never came home. The town looked different now. Main Street had been repaved. The old hardware store Carl Keller once owned was now an insurance office with vinyl siding and a blinking neon sign. The diner on Route 12 had changed hands twice, and the new owners didn't know who Diane was. The First Baptist Church still stood, but the field behind it, the place where the Ferris wheel once turned and the country band once played, was now a parking lot with faded yellow lines. Most of the people who remembered that August night were gone, dead or moved away, or too old to trust their memories anymore. Sheriff Raymond Coulter had been dead for 3 years. Heart attack in his living room, alone. Marion Steele, the deputy who'd discovered the missing evidence, had left Pine Hollow in 1985 and never returned. Tommy Granger was a ghost, his name mentioned only in whispers, and even then, rarely. The case file still existed, buried in a filing cabinet in the sheriff's office, yellowed and brittle. Every few years, a new deputy would stumble across it, read through the statements, shake their head, and put it back. Cold cases didn't get solved in towns like Pine Hollow. They just got forgotten. But some people never forgot. Michael Keller, Diane's older brother, was 51 years old now. He lived in Tuscaloosa, worked as an accountant for a small firm downtown, and hadn't been back to Pine Hollow in over a decade. He'd left when he was 18, eager to escape the slow suffocation of small-town life, and he'd only returned for funerals, his father's, his mother's, a handful of distant relatives. He thought about Diane often, more than he admitted to anyone. He remembered her as a child, following him around the house, asking too many questions, borrowing his records without permission. He remembered the way she'd looked at him when he told her he was leaving for college, a mixture of envy and sadness that he'd pretended not to notice. After she disappeared, he'd come back for a few weeks, helped search the woods, sat with his parents in the quiet, suffocating house. But eventually, he'd gone back to Tuscaloosa, back to his life. Because what else could he do? His parents had needed space to grieve, and Michael didn't know how to grieve in a way that helped anyone. He'd tried to move on, but the question never left him. What happened to her? In the spring of 2003, Michael received a phone call from a woman named Rachel Cobb. Rachel was a journalist based in Birmingham. She was 32 years old, sharp and persistent, and she'd spent the last 5 years working on a podcast about unsolved disappearances in the South. The podcast was called Under the Pines, and it had a small but dedicated following, people who listened while they drove to work, who sent tips and theories, who couldn't let go of stories that didn't have endings. Rachel had been researching Diane's case for months. She'd read every article she could find, requested police records, tracked down old witnesses, and now she wanted to talk to Michael. "I know this is difficult," Rachel said over the phone, her voice careful and respectful, "but I think there's more to your sister's story than what's been told. I think there are people in Pine Hollow who know something, and I want to find out what." Michael hesitated. He'd avoided talking about Diane for years, avoided the questions, the theories, the endless speculation, but something in Rachel's voice made him trust her. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Just your time," Rachel said. "And anything you remember." They met at a coffee shop in Tuscaloosa 2 weeks later. Rachel was smaller than Michael expected, with curly brown hair pulled into a ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes. She carried a leather bag stuffed with notebooks, a digital recorder, and a laptop covered in stickers. They talked for 3 hours. Michael told her about Diane, about the kind of person she was: quiet, thoughtful, sometimes too trusting. He told her about the weeks after she disappeared, the searches, the interviews, the way his parents had fallen apart in different directions. He told her about Tommy Granger, about the rumors, about the way the town had split in half. Rachel took notes, asked questions, listened carefully. "Do you think Tommy did it?" she asked. Michael paused. "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he did, because at least that would be an answer. But I never saw him as violent, just ... sad, pathetic, maybe." And the theory that she ran away. Michael shook his head. No, she wouldn't have done that. Not without telling someone, not without saying goodbye. Rachel nodded. She'd heard the same thing from others. Over the next 6 months, Rachel recorded a 5-part series on Diane Keller's disappearance. She interviewed former deputies, old classmates, people who'd been at the fair that night. She dug through archives, found the original newspaper articles, requested copies of the case file under the Freedom of Information Act. She discovered things the original investigation had missed or ignored. She found out that Tommy Granger had filed a restraining order against a man named Kevin Moss 2 months before Diane disappeared. Kevin was a drifter who'd worked briefly at Bledsoe's auto repair, and Tommy claimed Kevin had stolen tools and made threats. Kevin had left town before the order went through, and no one had thought to connect him to Diane's case. Rachel tracked Kevin Moss to a trailer park outside Mobile. She knocked on his door. Kevin was 59 now, rail-thin and grey, his face lined with years of hard living. He agreed to talk, though he seemed confused about why Rachel was there. "I barely knew her," Kevin said. "Met her once, maybe twice. She came by the shop to pick up her car. That's it. Were you at the fair the night she disappeared? Kevin hesitated. Might it been? I don't remember. That's a strange thing not to remember. It was 24 years ago, Rachel pressed. But Kevin's story didn't change. He hadn't seen Diane that night. Didn't know what happened to her. Had nothing to do with it. Rachel left with more questions than answers. She also tracked down Eugene Bartlett, the man who'd claimed to give Diane a ride. He was 73 now, living in a nursing home in Montgomery. His memory was spotty. His hands trembled, and he seemed to have trouble following the conversation. I gave a lot of people rides back then, Eugene said, his voice thin and wheezy. Hard to remember them all. But you told the sheriff it was Diane Keller. Did I? Yes. You said she was wearing a yellow dress, that she was headed to Birmingham. Eugene stared at the wall, his eyes distant. Maybe I was wrong. Rachel leaned forward. Eugene, do you know what happened to her? The old man blinked slowly. I don't remember much anymore. Rachel left the nursing home feeling hollow. Every lead was cold. Every witness was gone, or unreliable, or dead. But she kept digging. In November 2003, Rachel's podcast Under the Pines released its 5-part series on Diane Keller. The episodes were titled The Disappearance, The Contradictions, The Divide, The Missing Evidence. The series was downloaded thousands of times in the first week. People from Pine Hollow listened. People who'd moved away listened. People who'd never heard of Diane Keller listened. And then they couldn't stop thinking about her. The podcast reignited old arguments. Online forums filled with theories. Amateur detectives dissected every detail, pointed fingers, demanded answers. And slowly, something began to shift. People started talking. In December 2003, a woman named Brenda Milford reached out to Rachel. Brenda was 61 years old now, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived in Pine Hollow her entire life. She'd known Diane. They'd attended the same church, saw each other at community events. Brenda had been at the fair the night Diane disappeared, though she'd never been interviewed by the police. I saw something that night, Brenda said over the phone, her voice tight with emotion. And I've been too scared to say anything for 24 years. Rachel drove to Pine Hollow the next day. They met at Brenda's house, a small brick home on the edge of town. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs, children, grandchildren, a lifetime of memories. Brenda made tea, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. I was at the fair with my husband, Brenda said, sitting across from Rachel at the kitchen table. We were walking toward the parking lot around 11:30, maybe closer to midnight. And I saw Diane. Rachel leaned forward. Where? Near the edge of the field, close to the tree line. She was with someone who... Brenda's voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't see his face, but I saw them talking. And it didn't look friendly. She seemed upset. He had his hand on her arm, like he was trying to stop her from leaving. Can you describe him? Tall, dark jacket, I think. But it was dark, and I was far away. I didn't think much of it at the time. People argue. Couples fight. I figured it was her business. Rachel's pulse quickened. Why didn't you tell the police? Brenda looked down at her hands. Because the next day, when I heard she was missing, I told my husband what I'd seen. And he told me to stay out of it. He said, if I got involved, people would ask questions. They'd want to know what we were doing there, why we were leaving so late, and ... We were having an affair, Rachel. My husband and I. We weren't married yet. I was married to someone else. If I'd come forward, my whole life would have fallen apart. Rachel didn't judge. She just listened. I've regretted it every day since, Brenda said, tears streaming down her face. I could have helped. I could have told someone. But I didn't. And now everyone who might have known what happened is dead or gone. Rachel reached across the table and held Brenda's hand. You're telling someone now, Rachel said softly. Brenda's testimony was included in a bonus episode of Under the Pines, released in January 2004. It was titled, A Voice from the Shadows. The episode went viral. People called for the case to be reopened. The current sheriff, a man named Tom Ridley, issued a statement saying he would review the evidence. But privately, he told Rachel there wasn't much he could do. The case was decades old. The evidence was gone. The witnesses were unreliable. But the attention didn't fade. In February 2004, a man named Howard Bledsoe, the owner of the auto repair shop where Tommy Granger had worked, called Rachel. Howard was 78 years old, his voice hoarse from decades of smoking. He'd been following the podcast, listening to every episode, and something had been eating at him. I need to tell you something, Howard said. About the night Diane disappeared, Rachel drove to Pine Hollow again. Howard lived above the old repair shop, which had closed years ago. The building was sagging and grey, the sign out front barely legible. Inside, the air smelled like oil and dust. Howard sat in a worn armchair, an oxygen tank beside him, and told Rachel a story he'd kept secret for 24 years. Tommy came to the shop the morning after the fair. Howard said, early, maybe 6 a.m. I was opening up, and he was already there, waiting. He looked like hell, hadn't slept. His hands were shaking. What did he say? He asked me to help him with his truck. Said something was wrong with the engine. But when I looked at it, there was nothing wrong. The truck ran fine. Rachel frowned. So why did he ask? Howard's voice dropped. Because he wanted me to see it. He wanted me to know he'd been home that night, working on the truck. He wanted an alibi. Did you tell the police? Howard shook his head. Tommy's mother asked me not to. She begged me. Said her boy didn't do anything. Said the town would destroy him if I opened my mouth. And I believed her. Or I wanted to. So I kept quiet. Rachel's stomach tightened. Do you think Tommy killed Diane? Howard closed his eyes. I don't know, but I think he was scared of something. And I think whatever happened that night, he knew more than he said. Howard's testimony was released in another bonus episode in March 2004. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People called for Tommy Granger to be found and questioned, but no one knew where he was. He disappeared into the country, leaving no forwarding address, no trail. Some said he was dead. Others said he was hiding. In April 2004, Rachel received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was a cassette tape. No note, no return address, just the tape, old and unlabeled, wrapped in brown paper. Rachel's hands trembled as she loaded it into a player. The tape hissed and crackled, the sound quality poor, as if it had been recorded decades ago on cheap equipment. And then, a voice, faint, whispering, "She never left this town." Rachel played it again, and again. The voice was male, she thought, but distorted, muffled, as if the speaker was covering their mouth or standing far from the microphone. She never left this town. Rachel didn't know what to make of it. Was it real? A prank? A confession? She sent the tape to an audio forensics expert. The analysis came back inconclusive. The recording was old, possibly from the 1980s or 1990s. The voice couldn't be identified, but the words were clear. She never left this town. Rachel included the tape in the final bonus episode of Under the Pines, released in May 2004. The episode was called The Whisper. And with it, the series ended. But the story didn't, because somewhere in Pine Hollow, someone knew what had happened to Diane Keller, and they had known it all along. Summer 2004, the podcast had ended, but the questions remained. Rachel Cobb had moved on to other cases, other disappearances, but she still thought about Diane Keller every day. The anonymous tape haunted her. The whispered words, "She never left this town," played in her mind like a prayer or a curse, depending on the hour. She'd tried to trace the package. The postmark was smudged, barely legible, but it appeared to have been mailed from somewhere in Alabama. No fingerprints on the tape or the wrapping. No way to identify who had sent it. Rachel had theories. Everyone did. Maybe it was someone who'd been involved and couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Maybe it was a witness who'd stayed silent for decades and was finally ready to speak, but only anonymously. Maybe it was someone who wanted the case reopened, but was too afraid to come forward directly. Or maybe it was just a cruel prank. Rachel didn't know, but she couldn't let it go. In June 2004, she returned to Pine Hollow one more time. She told herself it was for closure. One last visit. One last walk through the town. One last conversation with the people who remembered. Then she'd move on. But deep down, she knew she was looking for something. She just didn't know what. Rachel stayed at a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the wallpaper was peeling and the air conditioner rattled through the night. She spent the days driving around, retracing Diane's path, visiting the places mentioned in the case file. She drove past the house on Oakwood Drive, where Diane had lived. It was occupied now by a young Familia woman, hanging laundry in the yard, 2 children playing in the driveway. Rachel didn't stop. She drove to the field behind the First Baptist Church, now a parking lot, and stood there for a long time, trying to imagine what it had looked like that August night in 1979. The Ferris wheel, the lights, the music. She drove out to Miller's Bridge, where the tire tracks had been found near the river. The bridge was still there, old and weathered, the wood soft with rot. Rachel stood at the railing and looked down at the slow-moving water, dark and choked with weeds. What had happened here? Had Diane driven to this bridge herself? Had someone brought her here? Had she gone into the water? Or had the tracks been a diversion, a way to throw the investigation off course? Rachel didn't know. On her third day in Pine Hollow, Rachel drove to the old auto repair shop where Tommy Granger had worked. The building was still there, but it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up. The sign Bledsoe's Auto Repair hung crooked from a single bolt. The paint faded and cracked. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete lot. Rachel parked and got out. She wasn't sure why she'd come here. Howard Bledsoe was dead. He'd passed away 2 months after their interview, his lungs finally giving out. Tommy Granger was gone, untraceable. There was nothing left here, but Rachel walked round the building anyway, peering through gaps in the boards, looking for something she couldn't name. Behind the shop, there was a small storage shed, half collapsed, its roof sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The door hung open, creaking in the breeze. Rachel approached slowly. Inside, the shed was dim and cluttered. Old tires stacked against the wall, rusted tools scattered on a workbench, cardboard boxes filled with oil-stained rags and broken parts. The air smelled of decay and motor oil. Rachel pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. She moved through the shed carefully, stepping over debris, shining the light into corners. She didn't know what she was looking for. Evidence, a clue. She didn't even know if she'd recognize it, if she found it. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the shed, beneath a pile of collapsed cardboard boxes, there was a wooden crate, old, dusty, partially hidden behind a stack of tires. Rachel pulled the boxes aside and dragged the crate into the light. It was heavy, the wood warped and stained. No markings, no label. She knelt beside it and pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a purse. Brown leather, long strap, tarnished metal clasp. Rachel's breath caught. She lifted the purse carefully, her hands trembling. The leather was dry and cracked, the strap frayed. She opened it. Inside, there was a wallet, a small tube of lipstick, a folded piece of paper, and a driver's license. Rachel pulled out the license and held it under the phone's light. The photo was faded, but the face was unmistakable. Diane Keller. Rachel sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. This was Diane's purse, the purse that had disappeared the night she vanished, the purse that had never been found. Rachel's mind raced. How did it get here? Who put it here? And why had it been hidden for 25 years? She reached for the folded piece of paper inside the wallet and opened it carefully. It was a note, handwritten on lined paper. The ink faded, but still legible. The note read, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought she'd understand. I thought she'd come back, but she didn't. And now I don't know what to do. God forgive me." There was no signature. Rachel stared at the words, her pulse racing. This was a confession, but whose? She photographed the note, the purse, the contents. She called the sheriff's office. Within an hour, Sheriff Tom Ridley arrived with 2 deputies. They secured the scene, bagged the evidence, and asked Rachel 100 questions. How did she find it? Why was she here? Had she touched anything else? Rachel answered as best she could, but her mind was elsewhere. The purse changed everything. It meant Diane hadn't run away. She hadn't taken her belongings and started a new life in Atlanta or Birmingham or anywhere else. She'd left her purse behind, or someone had taken it from her. And someone had hidden it here, in this shed, for 25 years. The discovery made headlines. Diane Keller's purse, found after 25 years. New evidence in cold case disappearance. Confession note discovered in Pine Hollow. The story spread quickly. Local news, national news, true crime forums. Everyone was talking about it. Sheriff Ridley reopened the case officially. He assigned a detective, a sharp young woman named Ashley Grimes, to lead the investigation. Ashley reviewed the old files, re-interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the new evidence. The note was sent to a handwriting expert. The purse was processed for fingerprints. The shed was searched top to bottom, but the answers were slow to come. The handwriting expert couldn't identify the author of the note. The style was generic, the lettering unpracticed, as if the writer had deliberately tried to disguise their hand. There were no fingerprints on the purse or the note either. They'd been wiped clean, or time had erased them. The shed had belonged to Howard Bledsoe, but he was dead. No one else had used it in years. The building had been abandoned since the late 1990s, and anyone could have accessed it. Detective Grimes interviewed Tommy Granger's mother, Clara, who was now 79, and living in a nursing home. Clara's memory was failing, but she insisted her son had nothing to do with Diane's disappearance. She claimed she hadn't seen Tommy in over 20 years, didn't know where he was. Grimes didn't believe her, but she couldn't prove otherwise. In August 2004, a man named Leon Pritchett came forward. Leon was 56, a long-haul truck driver who'd grown up in Pine Hollow but had left decades ago. He'd been following the news about the purse, and something had been bothering him. He called Detective Grimes and asked to meet. They met at a diner in Montgomery. Leon was a big man, broad-shouldered and graying, with calloused hands and tired eyes. He ordered coffee and stared into the cup for a long time before he spoke. "I need to tell you about Tommy Granger," Leon said. Grimes leaned forward. "Go on." "Tommy and I were friends back in high school. Close friends. We worked together at Bledsoe's for a while. Before I left town. Tommy, he had problems. Drank too much. Got angry over nothing. But he wasn't a bad guy. Just lost." "Did he talk about Diane?" Leon nodded. "All the time. He was obsessed with her. Couldn't let her go after she broke up with him. He'd drive past her house at night, sit in his truck, and just ... watch. He'd call her, leave messages. She told him to stop, but he didn't." "Did he ever threaten her?" Leon hesitated, not in so many words. "But one night, a few weeks before she disappeared, he told me something. We were at a bar, and he'd been drinking. He said, 'If I can't have her, no one will.' I thought he was just drunk and talking shit. But after she disappeared, I wondered." Grimes wrote this down. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Because I left town a month before she disappeared. I wasn't here when it happened, and I didn't want to get involved. I had my own life, my own problems. But now, with the purse and the note, I can't stay quiet anymore." "Do you know where Tommy is now?" Leon shook his head. "No. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Georgia. But that was years ago." Grimes thanked him and added his testimony to the file. The case was building, but it was still circumstantial. No body, no direct evidence linking Tommy to the crime. Just suspicions and second-hand stories. In September 2004, Detective Grimes received a call from a woman in Macon, Georgia. The woman's name was Linda Ferris, and she said she'd been married to Tommy Granger from 1987 to 1995. Grimes nearly dropped the phone. "You were married to Tommy Granger?" Grimes repeated. "Yes," Linda said. "I didn't know about Diane Keller until I saw the news. Tommy never told me about her. He never told me about Pine Hollow. He said he grew up in Mississippi, said his family was dead. I believed him. What happened to your marriage?" Linda's voice was bitter. "He left, just like that. Came home one day in 1995, packed a bag, and said he couldn't do it anymore. Wouldn't explain, wouldn't answer questions, just left. I haven't seen him since." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No, but I found something after he left. I was cleaning out the garage, and I found a box he'd hidden. Inside was a bunch of old photographs, newspaper clipping, and there was a picture of a woman. Young, blonde, pretty. On the back, someone had written, 'I'm sorry.'" Grimes felt her pulse quicken. "Do you still have that photograph?" "Yes. Can you send it to me?" 3 days later, the photograph arrived. Grimes opened the envelope carefully, her hand steady, but her heart racing. Inside was a Polaroid, faded and yellowed with age. The woman in the photo was smiling, standing in front of a Ferris wheel, her hair catching the light. It was Diane Keller, and on the back, in the same handwriting as the note found in the purse, were 2 words, "I'm sorry." Grimes stared at the photograph for a long time. This was it. This was the link. Tommy Granger had kept a photo of Diane for years, hidden away, carrying the guilt with him wherever he went. He'd written the note, he'd hidden the purse, and he knew what had happened to her. In October 2004, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Tommy Granger, but no one could find him. He'd vanished, just as completely as Diane had 25 years earlier. Detective Grimes sent out alerts to police departments across the country. She released Tommy's photograph to the media, asked for tips, for sighting, for any information. But weeks passed, and nothing came back. It was as if Tommy Granger had ceased to exist. And then, in November 2004, a body was found. November 18, 2004, a hunter named Dale Whitmore was walking through the woods near the Coosa River, about 40 miles northeast of Pine Hollow, when he found the body. It was late afternoon, the light filtering through the bare trees in weak, golden shaft. Dale had been tracking a deer for the better part of an hour, when he noticed something unusual. piece of fabric snagged on a low branch, fluttering in the breeze. He moved closer. The fabric was attached to a jacket, and the jacket was on a body. Dale called 911 from his truck, his voice shaking. The body was male, middle-aged, partially decomposed. It had been there for weeks, maybe longer. The coroner estimated death had occurred sometime in late September or early October. The man had been shot once in the chest. A .38 revolver was found near the body. Dental records confirmed his identity 2 days later. Tommy Granger. The news spread fast. Detective Ashley Grimes drove out to the scene the same day the identification came through. She stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the yellow police tape fluttering in the wind, trying to make sense of it. Tommy Granger had been dead for at least a month, maybe longer, which meant he'd died before the warrant was issued, before his photograph was released to the media, before anyone knew they were looking for him. Grimes spoke with the medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Elaine Stoddard. "What's your assessment?" Grimes asked. Dr. Stoddard pulled off her gloves and sighed. "Hard to say definitively, given the condition of the body, but the angle of the wound, the position of the gun, the lack of defensive injuries, it's consistent with suicide. Consistent with, that's my professional opinion, but I can't rule out homicide entirely. If someone wanted it to look like suicide, they did a decent job." Grimes frowned. Any other evidence at the scene? Not much. The body had been scavenged by animal. Wallet was still in his pocket, though, $43 and a Georgia driver's license. And this Dr. Stoddard handed Grimes a clear evidence bag. Inside was a small folded piece of paper, water-stained and brittle. Grimes opened it carefully. It was another note, handwritten in the same shaky script as the one found in Diane's purse. The note read, "I can't run anymore. I can't sleep. I see her every night. I thought if I stayed away, it would stop. But it never does. I'm sorry, Diane. I'm sorry for everything. Maybe now you can rest." Grimes read it twice, her jaw tight. This was a confession. Tommy Granger had killed himself, and he'd left a note admitting guilt. But it still didn't answer the most important question. Where was Diane? Grimes returned to Pine Hollow and continued the investigation. She brought in cadaver dogs and search teams. They combed the woods near Bledsoe's auto repair, the areas around Miller's Bridge, the riverbanks, the fields. They found nothing. In December 2004, Grimes received a call from Marion Steele. Marion was the former deputy who'd discovered the missing evidence back in 1980. She was 71 now, living in Florida, but she'd been following the case closely. When she heard about Tommy's death and the note, she called Grimes. "There's something I need to tell you," Marion said. "Something I should have said a long time ago." They spoke for over an hour. Marion told Grimes about the missing evidence, the Polaroid photos, the cassette tapes, the gold ring engraved with Diane's initials. She told her about Sheriff Coulter's decision to keep it quiet, about the way the case had been mishandled from the start. "But there's something else," Marion said. "Something I never told anyone." "What?" "The night Diane disappeared. I was at the fair, off duty. I saw Diane talking to someone near the parking lot. I didn't think much of it at the time. People were talking to each other all night. But later, when I was reviewing the witness statements, I realized no one had mentioned this person." "Who was it?" Marion hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but I think it was Howard Bledsoe." Grimes went silent. Howard Bledsoe. The man who owned the auto repair shop. Yes, he was older, maybe in his 50s back then. But I'm almost certain it was him. I remember because he had this distinctive way of standing hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. And I remember thinking it was odd, because Howard didn't usually go to the fair. He wasn't a social person. "Did you tell Sheriff Coulter?" "No. At the time, I didn't think it mattered. But after the evidence went missing, and after I found out Howard had lied about Tommy's alibi, I started to wonder." Grimes thanked Marion and hung up. Howard Bledsoe was dead. He'd died in 2004, just months after his interview with Rachel Cobb. There was no way to question him now. But Grimes had an idea. She went back to the auto repair shop. This time, she brought a full forensics team. They tore the place apart. They searched the shed, the garage, the office. They pulled up floorboards, checked walls, dug through the crawl space beneath the building. And in the garage, beneath a section of concrete flooring that had been poured years after the original construction, they found something. Bones, human bones. The forensics team worked carefully, excavating the remains over the course of 3 days. The bones were fragile, discolored, but intact enough for analysis. DNA testing confirmed what Grimes already knew. The remains belonged to Diane Keller. She had been there all along, buried beneath the floor of the garage where Tommy Granger had worked, hidden in plain sight for 25 years. The revelation shattered Pine Hollow. The town that had spent a quarter-century debating whether Diane had been murdered or had run away now had its answer. She had been murdered, and she had never left. Detective Grimes pieced together the story as best she could, using the notes, the testimonies, and the evidence. Diane had gone to the fair that night. She had been seen talking to someone, possibly Howard Bledsoe, possibly Tommy Granger, possibly both. At some point, she'd gotten into an argument. Maybe she'd threatened to report something. Maybe she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Whatever the reason, she'd been killed. Tommy had likely been involved. The notes, the photograph, the guilt he'd carried for decades, all of it pointed to him. But Grimes suspected Howard Bledsoe had been involved too. Maybe Howard had killed her, and Tommy had helped cover it up. Or maybe it was the other way round. Grimes would never know for certain. Both men were dead. The only witnesses were gone. But Diane's body had been found, and that was something. In January 2005, Diane Keller was laid to rest in Pine Hollow Cemetery, beside her parents. The funeral was small. Michael Keller was there, along with a handful of people who remembered Diane. Rachel Cobb attended, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. The local news covered the story. National outlets picked it up. Cold case solved after 25 years. But for the people of Pine Hollow, it didn't feel like a solution. It felt like a wound that had finally been opened, and the infection beneath was worse than anyone had imagined. The town remained divided. Some believed Tommy Granger had acted alone. Others believed Howard Bledsoe was the real killer. Still others whispered about conspiracies, about cover-ups, about people in power who had protected the guilty. The truth, Grimes knew, was probably simpler and uglier than any theory. Two men had done something terrible, and they had spent the rest of their lives trying to live with it. Rachel Cobb returned to Birmingham and continued her podcast. She released a final episode on Diane Keller in February 2005, titled The End of Silence. In it, she reflected on the case, on the people she'd interviewed, on the years of searching, and the bittersweet resolution. She ended the episode with these words. Diane Keller was 23 years old when she disappeared. She was a teacher, a daughter, a sister. She had a life, a future, dreams that would never be realized. For 25 years, she was a mystery, a name whispered in the dark, a question without an answer. But she was never just a mystery. She was a person, and she deserved to be remembered. Her story is over now, but the silence that surrounded it, the fear, the lies, the complicity of a community that chose not to see that silence is still with us. It always has been. Maybe that's the real lesson of Diane Keller's story, that some truths are buried, not by accident, but by choice, and that the hardest thing to uncover isn't the evidence, it's the courage to face what it means. Diane is at rest now, but the questions she left behind will haunt Pine Hollow for generations to come. The episode was downloaded over 100,000 times in the first week. People left comments, sent messages, shared their own stories of small towns and buried secrets. And slowly, gradually, Diane Keller became more than a cold case. She became a reminder that the past doesn't stay buried, that silence is its own kind of violence, and that sometimes the truth survives only in the memories of those who still wait. Pine Hollow today is quieter than it was in 1979. The population has dwindled. Main Street is half empty. The First Baptist Church still stands, but the congregation is smaller now, grayer. The field behind the church is still a parking lot. Bledsoe's auto repair was torn down in 2006 after the remains were found. The lot sits empty now, overgrown with weeds and kudzu. Miller's Bridge was replaced with a modern concrete span in 2010. The old wooden structure was dismantled, its planks hauled away. But people still talk about Diane Keller. Her story is told in high school classrooms, in late-night conversations, in true crime documentaries and podcasts. It's become part of the town's identity, a scar that never quite heals. Michael Keller still lives in Tuscaloosa. He's retired now, spends his days reading and gardening. He doesn't talk about Diane much, but he thinks about her every day. He keeps a photograph of her on his desk, a picture from her college graduation, smiling and hopeful, her whole life ahead of her. Sometimes, late at night, he wonders what she would have become, what kind of teacher she would have been, whether she would have married, had children, grown old. He'll never know, None of them will. But he takes comfort in one small thing. Diane is home now. She's with their parents. She's at rest. And after 25 years of silence, her story has finally been told. Detective Ashley Grimes moved on to other cases, but she never forgot Diane Keller. The case taught her something she carried with her for the rest of her career. That justice is rarely neat, that answers are rarely complete, that sometimes the best you can do is uncover the truth and let it speak for itself, and that even in the darkest stories, there is a kind of grace in finally knowing. Rachel Cobb continued her work, investigating cold cases, telling the stories of the missing and the forgotten. She never stopped thinking about Diane, about the woman in the yellow dress who walked into a town fair on a hot August night and never walked out, about the silence that followed, and about the whisper on the tape. She never left this town. It had been true all along. In the end, Diane Keller's story is not just about a disappearance, or a murder, or a decades-long investigation. It's about a community that fractured under the weight of a lie, about the people who stayed silent because silence was easier than truth, about the way guilt can spread like rot, infecting everything it touches, and about the long, slow journey toward light. Diane's grave is visited often. People leave flowers, sometimes notes. Strangers who never knew her, but feel connected to her story. The headstone is simple, grey granite, with her name and the years of her life, 1956 to 1979. But someone, years ago, added a line beneath the dates, carved in smaller letters. She is not forgotten, and she isn't, because the stories we bury don't stay buried. They rise eventually, like bones from the earth, and they demand to be told.